Hi everyone, I'm Pierre-Olivier Pineau. I'll be presenting on the Quebec and Canada's electricity situation. So after some kind of worldwide view, I'll present maybe more depressing views on where we stand right now. So I don't have a microgrid background, so I will not promote microgrids, and I'll probably calm us down in the transition. Not that I don't want us to stay in our stage. I would like us to be in a 2070 grid system that Gretchen presented us, but I think for a while we'll stay in the stage where we are now, and we have bigger challenges. So why do we have these biggest challenges? If here in this graph you see basically how much energy per capita we use, and I have the sad news to announce that Canada is leading the world in per capita energy consumption, and then here you see per different types of usage. So basically industrial, transportation, agricultural, residential, and commercial. We're basically above everyone else in the world in terms of energy consumption. So, of course, the idea that we can feed this energy appetite by local sources close to consumption sites, it's a bit unreal that we will need to rely on some kind of large-scale energy production sites to feed us. Not that I like this kind of model, but if we look at who we are now in terms of energy consumption, we need large-scale energy production sites. So you'll tell me, well, this is all energy types. It's not only electricity, and this is a microgrid seminar. So if we look more specifically at electricity consumption, we're not leading the world. So Iceland is leading the world in terms of per capita energy consumption, and Iceland is a very small country, only 300,000 inhabitants, and they lead the world with 51,000 kilowatt hours per year, per person. So that's extremely huge. That's actually more than twice the Quebec consumption. We're second on that chart. And Iceland could be considered as a microgrid. And the reason why they consume so much energy is because they have a lot of hydroelectricity, lots of geothermal electricity, so all renewable, most of it is renewable. I think it's almost 100% of renewable electricity. So their drivers is actually, they don't have any drivers to reduce because it's clean, it's cheap, so they can afford to be inefficient, and it's not a problem. But in terms of Quebec, well, we also have clean and cheap electricity and non-emitting electricity. So, so again, the driver for having microgrids where we manage locally isn't here. Canada is at a different level because you see Canada's average is 13,000 kilowatt hours. So the situation is different, and as we will see in the next slide, Canada's electricity production is not exactly as the Quebec one, so there are lots of differences across Canada, but it's very different. But what we could see when Peter was mentioning that microgrids are developing in developing countries, of course it makes sense, because if we look here at Haiti and South Sudan, for example, I took the two bottom countries in terms of energy consumption, well, electricity consumption per capita. It is, of course, much easier to have a small-scale generator and microgrid to serve this kind of loads, like 39 kilowatt hour per year per person, compared to the kind of loads we have in Quebec with 21,000. So of course we can expect much more development of microgrids in this kind of regions where we have low consumption, which makes a lot of sense. And of course I'm totally in favor. And again, I shouldn't take the data I present as being against microgrids. I'm just saying that for Canada, and particularly Quebec, I mean, we have other challenges to deal with before thinking of creating microgrids or integrating microgrids. We are just, we such a big energy appetites that it may not make a lot of sense to look at microgrids. And then another reason, here you see the capacity, the electricity production by different provinces. We start by Newfoundland and Labrador on the left here, to BC on the right, and then the blue is hydropower. So, and then most of it, I mean, the huge majority of this hydropower is large-scale hydropower. So if you look at Quebec, we produce almost 200 terawatt hours of hydroelectricity. Large scale up in the north, there's no way we'll bring that down to solar panels in Montreal, and we'll exchange that, especially since this large-scale hydropower is extremely cheap. The procurement cost, the average procurement cost for Hydro-Quebec production is 2 cents per kilowatt hour. So of course you need to add the transmission cost and distribution cost, but even when you add all these additional costs, it's extremely cheap. So for Newfoundland, Labrador, Quebec, Manitoba here, it's all hydro. BC, it's all hydro. For these provinces with large-scale cheap hydro, the prospect of bringing microgrids when they have already built large cheap hydro, already built transmission systems, it's the idea of a non-integrated grid. It doesn't make much sense in the current context. And in addition to that is that we've built in a culture of loving our vertically integrated utility. And whoever would, as a politician, would come and say we'll break Hydro-Quebec in different companies, production on one side, transmission and distribution on the other side, in order to promote competition. I mean, whichever politician brings that idea to Quebec voters won't be elected first, or would not stay in office long enough to finish the sentence. And so there are a lot of cultural issues beyond the fact that it doesn't make economic sense in Quebec. It might make some sense in some other provinces like Alberta, and to some extent Alberta. We could argue that it's already a kind of microgrids, interconnected grids, because they have more municipally based production. So around Edmonton, around Calgary, and they have transmission networks. So already well, to some extent, we could argue that they're already in that kind of paradigm, although most of the fossil fuel generation that they have is currently coal. They'll move towards gas and wind farms, but again, they haven't chosen the decentralized production mode. They have like large-scale wind farms that they will build, and they'll just take their coal power plants and switch to natural gas. So they'll keep basically the same kind of business model. In Ontario, they've made the choice to refurbish the nuclear power plants, so they'll pay a hell lot of money to refurbish these nuclear power plants. They haven't discovered yet how much more it will cost them compared to, because they all just started, so they haven't had the chance to see that it costs more than what they planned for. But most likely it will cost more than what they're planning. So they'll regret not moving towards microgrids, but they have cultural issues that they have to fight for, which is much bigger than the challenge of taking the technology and implementing the technology. They have institutions that are promoting these kind of centralized systems, which are, of course, problematic. And the cost, I've already mentioned the cost, but just to see in terms of average cost per kilowatt hour here on the horizontal axis, and the per capita consumption on the vertical axis, you see all provinces here. Quebec stands here, so beyond 20,000 kilowatt hour per capita. Manitoba is not far, and we have access to extremely cheap electricity, hydroelectricity. BC is third in terms of prices. So we see that, of course, it makes a difference, but for some provinces, these low costs are here to stay. Of course, they'll increase slightly over years, but hydropower won't get much more expensive in terms of what is already installed. And we have so much already installed, we don't know what to do with it, that we are just heating all our basements and then not doing the energy efficiency that we could do. So we have many years of improvements before we can think of moving towards another system. Just to finish with a few more stats, in Quebec we have 5.3 kilowatts of installed capacity per person. In Canada, the average is something like 2.5 kilowatt per capita installed. So again, in Quebec, if you are thinking of designing a microgrid system at 5.3 kilowatt per person, I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense. You can design microgrid systems for very small consumption and a small peak needs, but we're far from this kind of situation. So again, low electricity prices, a lot of electric heating. So these are not, again, big drivers for microgrids. I mentioned the fact that we have a dominant integrated utility. It's an identity icon. We need to change that, but there's a huge cultural challenge. We need to talk to Quebecers and tell them that, you know, there are better things to do with our hydroelectricity. We need to change than heating our basements and well, different things and spa and swimming pools. Well, just to close off, the real challenges are really regulatory, cultural. Of course, we need technical innovation, but technical innovation is already here. What is lacking in Quebec and Canada is really the cultural and regulatory drive to bring in these new technologies. So thank you very much for attention, and I'm just on time, I think.